Welcome to The Hollywood Outsider, a weekly entertainment podcast available at thehollywoodoutsiders.com, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I am Amanda Sink, and I'll be your host for this special episode of The Hollywood Outsider, because every once in a while, we like to bring you interviews with independent filmmakers to give you an insight into both what goes into getting their projects made, as well as insight into the respective art itself. For this episode, I am speaking with Ralph D'Amato, the producer and visionary of the documentary Pretending I'm a Superman, the Tony Hawk video game story. Yes, you did hear me correct, that Tony Hawk. Pretending I'm a Superman is a documentary that tells the story of how skateboarding became a part of the mainstream by focusing on the success of the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater video game franchise. The film stars pro skateboarding legends Tony Hawk, Rodney Mullen, Steve Caballero, Chad Muska, and Jamie Thomas. Now, if you're like me, you loved these games. You grew up with these games, you knew Tony's name, you knew about skating, you loved to skate, even if you were terrible at it, but you were just invested in this industry, this sport, this movement that Tony Hawk had created. So, of course, this is an exciting opportunity because not only did we get to watch this documentary and we get to recommend it to you, but we get to talk with Ralph. And Ralph started on the billion-dollar Tony Hawk's Pro Skater video game franchise, where he was a producer on the first 8 titles. During that time, his production tasks included character art, animation, legal, licensing, and interacting with the skaters and their sponsors. His responsibility also included the iconic soundtracks for the video games, one of which won the first ever MTV Video Music Award for video game soundtrack, Tony Hawk's Underground. After departing the video game franchise, Ralph went on to become director of new media for Tony Hawk Incorporated. And here's where it gets even better because we love our independent filmmakers. In 2017, Ralph founded an independent film production studio called D'Amato Productions, where he produced his first full-length feature documentary, Pretending I'm a Superman. And we're here to talk about it with him. So Ralph took some time to call in to discuss his career, why he wanted to tell the Tony Hawk story, a guy who's obviously invested in the Tony Hawk brand, because he spent most of his professional career working for the guy, and how this project actually came to be. Now, I do want you to be mindful this is a phone interview, so audio isn't always perfection, as much as we would like it to be. But without further ado, take a listen to my interview with the producer of Pretending I'm a Superman, the Tony Hawk video game story, which is available on August 18th on Video on Demand. Here's my interview with Ralph D'Amato.
Doing well. Nice to meet you, Amanda.
Good to meet you also. So I'm sure you're pretty excited with this film coming out, this documentary, and it's your first one producing, right?
Yeah. First feature length film I've ever produced. I've done a lot of different content. I worked for Tony for 4 years, so I've done a lot of different, action sports content, and I worked on a website with him. So done a lot of little short pieces and stuff, but yeah, this is the first full length film. So yeah, we're pretty excited for sure.
So tell me about this, because you've been involved with Tony Hawk Pro Skater since the first game's development, then you transitioned to Tony Hawk Incorporated. Now you're producing this film. What has made you so drawn to this game franchise and just the overall Tony Hawk brand?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of fell into the Pro Skater franchise. I knew Joel Jewett. He's the president of Neversoft. I knew him, and I was in, out of college, I was a sales executive, so I just was doing sales. But in knowing Joel and talking to him about his video game company, he knew my passion for video games. I've been a huge video game player since I was a kid. I dropped all my quarters into the arcade machines. So he ended up getting a couple big projects and needed some help in production and reached out to me and asked if I wanted to interview, if I was thinking of maybe changing careers. And it was a bit scary because I was a sales executive. I had already owned a house. I was doing pretty well for myself, but the opportunity to get into the video game industry was a huge thing for me. When I went to school, there were no such things as video game producers because,
right.
Video games were much smaller. You had just one or two different people, programmers maybe working on a video game. Teams didn't really necessitate having a producer. So it was great. It was a great opportunity. I took it. And like I said, Joel had two projects. One was a big licensed Spider-Man game. It was going to be one of the first, if not the first, Spider-Man console game. And the other was at the time, what was seen as a little skateboarding video game. I did have some experience in skating. I skated as a kid. I don't consider myself a skater, but it was one of those things in the late 70s, having a little plastic board. And if I didn't want to bring my bike, I would bring my skateboard. So I knew Tony, I'd watched the videos. I knew Tony Hawk. I knew a lot of the skaters. So it just kind of seemed natural. I was put on the small video game, the small skateboarding video game. And that kind of blew up into, over $1 billion franchise, which I was stoked to work on. The team that we worked with, they were all really amazing people. I've still, I still consider most of my friends are on my Facebook. We hang out. And I did that for 8 years, and it's 8 years at the same kind of project where you're making a video game a year in 9 months. You've got 9-month dev cycle, because then the rest of the time you're really in testing and submission and then distribution. It's a grueling process to do for over and over again. And at about the 8-year mark, I was about ready to have a summer vacation and try something new. So I reached out to all of my contacts like you do, hey, it was great working with you, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to be moving on from Neversoft. Reached out to all the skaters. I sent one to Tony, and literally 20 minutes after I sent it to him, he had sent me an email back asking if he'd had a new mobile position. And back then, mobile plans and mobile products were ringtones and wallpapers, but he had this new license for it and needed someone to help manage it. And he offered me a job. And I told him, hey, as long as I could go, I was planning on going to Italy and doing a little vacation. As long as I could have a few weeks off when I come back, I'd be more than happy to come out and interview for the position. And I did, and I took it. And I worked for Tony for about 4 years as his director of new media. So went from video game industry into action sports industry, which is quite a bit different. But again, skateboarding, and Tony Hawk was sort of, it was still kind of working to protect and working to advance the name Tony and the brand of Tony Hawk. So yeah, it was a great 4 years of working with him. We developed a website called Shred or Die. We partnered with the Funny or Die people to do an action sports portal, and that was a blast. And then it just it got to a point where there wasn't as much of a need for a salary of a video game producer. And I also wanted to go and do other things. I had started consulting, apps had started blowing up. Everybody wanted an app. So I parted ways with Tony amicably. We're still friends to this day, and started doing app production. I worked with, I did apps for Real Madrid, for Cristiano Ronaldo, DJ Pauly D, a bunch of different celeb integrated apps. And then I started doing video games again. And one of the video games that I did is called Endless Skater. It's in the iPhone and for Android. And I cooked up with some of the past developers, Chris Roush, he and Steve Ganem. Chris was one of the original designers on the game. Ganem was an amazing programmer. They had opened up a video game company. So we did this mobile skateboarding game. And during that time, I sort of had an idea of, I'm a huge documentary nut. So I watch any kind of documentary, any kind of topic. And I was asking Chris about, hey, I think this is probably 2014, 2015. I think I want to do a documentary about our video game experience and what we did. And he kind of threw a gauntlet down and was like, hey, if anybody should do it, it should be you.
So what's that process been like for this many years that you've been working on it, and what kept you invested in this particular project of doing the documentary?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that was when I met Ludwig. I kind of found he was a fan of the series, and he had a YouTube channel. He put up this amazing, like really in-depth video, the history of Tony Hawk video games, and I was just floored by all the detail in it. And my wife's urging, she was like, "Oh, why don't you message him?" And I was doing the typical, guy thing. No, I'm not going to message him. And then eventually messaged him, and we kind of became friends. And, we talked a bit, and he was just overwhelmed by somebody at Neversoft because this was his video game. This is like his childhood. So I actually went out to Sweden, met him, didn't really talk about a documentary at that time. He came back California the following year. We hung out. He stayed at my place. We started talking more. And that's when I was like, hey, together, he had thought about doing a full length doc. I had, on his own, but he didn't have the contacts or avenues to get the interviewees that like I did. I had that part of it, but I didn't have the director chops or how to weave a story. And that was what that's what he was going to school. And that's what he wanted to do, is become a director. So I hooked him up that night. I asked Tony, I reached out to Tony and said, hey, probably the biggest fan of the series is here in town from Sweden. Do you have some time on Monday? Maybe sit down with him. And Tony obliged. So Ludwig went and met Tony. Ludwig pitched the idea to Tony as well. And, then it was just tons and tons of Skype calls between the two of us to get it to happen, to get, we did a little Indiegogo. We got a lot of attention, and that really opened our eyes to, we did an interview with Rolling Stone at the time, and it was like, wow, okay, so we really there's press, there's people that really, really want this doc, and it kind of kept us motivated to keep going and trudging through the process that neither of us had done before. I mean, I produced a lot of different things, but producing a film has its own, unique things that if you don't know and you make mistakes, you better learn fast, because mistakes can be pretty costly. So yeah, it was just a long process of tons and tons of Skype calls and late nights, doing weird hours, because he's in Sweden, I'm in Orange County, California. So yeah, and between the two of us, we just kept each other really motivated and on track.
So with the film that you produced, Pretending I'm a Superman, the Tony Hawk video game story, it shows an in memoriam to Rafael D'Amato. Would you like to share some information about why you felt it was so important to recognize them?
Yeah, that's my dad. My dad's a huge part of my life. I'm an immigrant son. My parents came here from Italy on a boat, literally on a boat, when they were my mom was 18, my dad was in his early 20s. And so the struggle that they had in their life to go from two people with nothing in their pockets, not really an education, didn't really know the language, to owning a house in Orange County, putting two kids through college. My parents didn't want us to work when we went to college, so we didn't work. My brother went to Santa Barbara. I went to Cal Poly Pomona. That whole struggle that they did is really part of why we stayed on track through this film too, because I really wanted to. My dad was always a big part of everything that I did, and he was always super supportive in every aspect. So yeah, I mean, that dedication. And if you look at the D'Amato Productions logo at the beginning of the film, you see a guy playing the accordion. That's my dad.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's a really cool way to honor him.
And that's him playing the accordion too. So yeah, it's the least I could do for someone that did so much for me.
Yeah, definitely. So when you're talking about putting this film together and it's in works for years, and then there's the remastering release of THPS 1 and 2 coming up, slated, I believe, for September. Did you time the release of this film with that? Were you connected to those remasters?
Just like a lot of things in this film, there's a lot of real good serendipity. I mean, that we had no knowledge of from Activision while we were at the beginning of making this film, or timing it and that kind of thing. Certainly when hearing about it, it's like, okay, this is really cool. This makes us very happy. I had, when I initially talked to Tony about being in the documentary, I did tell him, hey, it would be great. And this is probably 2015, probably 2016, 2017. I was telling, I told a lot of the skaters, Tony, Jamie, Chad, it would be great if this thing could be like a commercial to launch the series, because that series, for every developer that worked on that, especially the first, the guys that are the original team members, that series is always going to be near and dear to our hearts. And me specifically, my nephew is a big time skateboarder. He's a really, really good skateboarder. And I've always wanted to play the skateboarding game that I helped create with him. So, it's going to be great when it comes out. I've already bought a couple of the collector's editions and the online editions. So yeah, I mean, I definitely am looking forward to playing it, knowing the people. I know some of the folks over at Vicarious Visions, the developers. I personally haven't seen anything other than what's on TV, with the commercials and everything. But just knowing some of the developers there, I know this thing's going to knock it out of the park. Vicarious Visions did a bunch of the ports back in the day to other platforms, and they always did really good work. So I'm really stoked, and I'm just as much. I mean, obviously, more so for my film because it's mine. But come that release date of the video game, I'm going to be in front of my Xbox One for sure for quite a few hours.
So one of the other things that became so notable from THPS is the soundtrack. Because, I mean, you have so many other great things that came from it, and it gave notoriety to some of the best skateboarders in the world. But didn't you have a little bit of a hand in the soundtrack? And how would you feel about this thing that became, people still listen to it now. I still listen to them now.
Yeah, we had a soundtrack team at Neversoft, and it was I'd say about 5 or 6 of us. Music back then isn't like today. You can't just go on Spotify and look up every song you want. There was no Spotify. So we would sit in a room and we would listen to CDs, and we would people would throw out suggestions here and there. And I was the producer that would organize those suggestions into a spreadsheet, figure out what kind of budget we had. The last budget that I worked with, it was about $500,000 for soundtrack. And then I worked with the music producer our supervisor over at Activision. At the time, it was Tim Riley and Brandon Young. They would then reach out to the labels and the bands to get all of the costs. We get those costs back, and then it's a shuffle on how we can get this budget to work with these amount of tracks that we wanted, because skateboarding is an eclectic taste of music. You got people that listen to hip hop, people that listen to thrash, people that listen to punk, people that listen to electronica. So it was always a challenge making a robust soundtrack, and it always came down to, how many tracks, how much budget we had. And then along the way, people would send us music, and we'd do a lot of gratis licenses for small up and coming bands that we thought, that song is really cool. It could really fit the soundtrack. And so we would do that. And we even did it for some of the people internally, like developers. Like I'm a bass player in a band. We played my band. I put my band in the game in Tony Hawk's Underground 2. Sin City by Dead End Road is my band. And to this day, from that game, we'll get like 25, 30,000 plays a month on Spotify. And that's not a lot of money, 30, 40, sometimes $60 a month, but we're a no-name Orange County cover band. And because that song was in that game in Tony Hawk's Underground 2, we get lumped into all the Tony Hawk playlists. And so we get a bunch of plays on that song just based on it being in the game. So the impact of the game is huge. And if you look at other bands on Spotify and you look at the songs that were in the game, usually those are their top played songs. Definitely the funnest part of production for me was working on the soundtrack, is, being a bass player, being a musician, and then being able to work with these bands and license things from, AC/DC and Johnny Cash. I mean, how cool is that?
Right.
Yeah. So that was definitely one of the more fun production aspects that I did.
So I know we kind of have a little bit of a time crunch here. I want to ask you one last thing. Where can people find the film when it comes out on August 18th?
So it's pretty much going to be on all the major on-demand platforms, iTunes, Amazon, DirecTV, on-demand. If you go to our website, thpsfilm.com, or any of our social media at thpsfilm, you'll see right on our website, we have the logos of the on-demands that it'll be available. And those logos will start expanding. And then we'll start, as we have the direct links all set up, we'll start adding links. But pretty much everywhere, it's going to be on most of the cable systems and a lot of the major on-demand platforms domestically. And then I know we have international as well, and it'll just keep on expanding to all the different markets.
Well, that's awesome. I'm so happy for you, and congratulations. And also a huge thank you for stopping by the Hollywood Outsider podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, we're stoked. Hope everybody loves the film, and yeah, check us out.
It was a good time. It was very nostalgic.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.
Once again, thank you so much for listening to the Hollywood Outsider podcast. We try to bring you interviews with filmmakers in the world of independent cinema whenever we can, so I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Remember to subscribe and review us on Apple Podcasts. We love that. Spotify, or your favorite podcast app of choice. Our normal show has new episodes every Tuesday and is available at thehollywoodoutsiders.com. This is Amanda Sink reminding you that the next time you head into the theater, which is happening soon, people, or you're playing the remastered Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, buy popcorn.